when we are developing crisis communication strategies for our clients, we first start out with the risk assessment. And that is, excuse me, where we take a look at, and we answer the question, what could happen? And even starting with the those 8 little areas of how we are ethical and reverse engineering what could happen with that is always, I believe, something very important to talk about. And then even taking a look at how the human element could reverse engineer those and go down possibly a negative path based on something that might be happening. Let's talk about some of the risk assessments that you've been involved in, before starting your own firm, which, by the way, you're such a gift to so many people. You were involved in very, very large corporations and some startup corporations as well. What was the landscape of even having a risk assessment discussion on the table?
Yeah, like I said, it wasn't top of mind.
Yeah.
It was mostly about how do we differentiate in the market? How do we be defensible? What markets do we go after? But the notion of thinking about crisis management is probably near the bottom of the list, right?
Right.
The bottom 25% of the list. However, as AI has become more prominent and as AI has been infused in many of the products, it's slowly creeping up to the top, especially as we're hearing more about these fraudulent things that are happening or deep fakes, those types of things, right? But the other thing that I think is propelling it, and I haven't seen a lot of companies doing this yet, is AI could also potentially have impacts on the workforce.
Right.
So whether it's reductions in force, needing to upskill and reskill employees, finding people that have AI skills. And you may not think about that as crisis, but that could be considered crisis because people are nervous, people are afraid, people are almost paralyzed. Some people are paralyzed because of the potential threat of AI replacing them or people that know AI replacing them. And I think that's also one aspect of many of these startups or even larger companies are thinking about, right? Grammarly just recently had a reduction in force, and they were very forthcoming about this being more AI driven or AI influenced their decisions.
Right.
Not many companies are doing that. They're very, very transparent, right? So I think they're trying to get ahead of potential crisis in that aspect. So I think when we think about crisis, we think about like security and deepfakes and all sorts of things, but we also need to think about the human element of this, of, alleviating or at least minimizing fear of people.
Right. Yeah, and when we're developing a crisis plans, we scale it all out. So what is a 5 would be something horrible that could happen, that no matter what, we pull out no stops, all the stops rather, to really make sure that it's tackled immediately and all the parties know there's a communication tree, so on and so forth. And a 1 might be just trying to get ahead of something that could turn into a crisis if not managed correctly. So there's really the unknown and the known when it comes to management of that and everything else that fits in between. One of the things that I think is really cool about what we're talking about when it comes to risk assessment is the scenario planning as well. And I was involved in a crisis communications plan that we were writing for a client about 15 years ago. And certainly we were discussing technology and cybersecurity and components like that. But we were also discussing a lot of what, some of the sad things about that, what could happen that would cause, the need for an immediate response, such as employee death in the workforce. I mean, so that's where employee death while traveling, just all these sort of things you need to be considering when developing a crisis comms plan. Another scenario was, what if this was a recent program that we worked on a few years ago? What if this major competitor, we're trying to needle them a little bit with some information and strength to release some data points that we own? What if they don't comply? So we had in this situation a green light, and red light that we knew we were going to deploy in the event something happened. So that those scenario plannings, although the example I used was very sad, they still need to be included in day-to-day crisis comms. AI, kids doing horrible things with something that is generated on AI that has nothing to do with your brand, and then going and doing something and getting hurt is another scenario that you really need to take into consideration.
Yeah. Lori, the way that you've described it, it's a very analytical process, actually, when we think about scenario planning and risk assessment. And what's interesting about that, Lori, my head automatically goes to AI can actually help with that,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So,
we're looking at it.
yeah, AI can actually help us with crisis management planning, scenario planning. When you think about red, yellow, greens, my head goes straight to, hey, let's build a heat map, right?
Mhm.
For each of these 8 things in the responsible AI principles, what are the scenarios that would be like blue all the way to red,
Right,
right? And then for each one of those, and it doesn't have to be hard, right? Yeah, especially with the help of AI. Let's think about what ifs. It's kind of like a decision tree, right? If this happens, then do this. If that happens, do that. And I can pretty much see how AI can help with figuring that out and maybe even doing some calculations to determine, okay, if these combinations of things happen, then these would be the best courses of action, right?
right,
Moving forward. The other element of this is just the human side of it, the communications part, right? And I think we oftentimes just think about the mechanical pieces of it, but how do we communicate, right?
right.
That is just so critical right now because even in that communication, our people that we've destroyed trust or we've minimized the trust. How do we rebuild? Not just managing the crisis, but building again the loyalty or the trust that was eroded as a result.
I
So,
agree. And you bring up an interesting point here, and then I wanna go back to the comms planning on this in just a second. Some of the best communications plans make sure that the crisis never hits the media. It never hits the customer. We've been able to divert it in such a way that nobody knows about it. And of course, there's the ethical side of that. If it is something the customer must know, no matter what, you let them know. But half of it is keeping it out of the media's purview so that it doesn't turn into something that it isn't. So we make sure, and in this scenario that I talked about a few years ago, that was the primary goal. The red light, green light, yellow light approach was we do not want customers to know about this. We don't want the media to know about it. What can we do to keep it out and just under the table while negotiations are taking place? And by the way, so I'm reflecting on that and the communication that took place, and going back to communication, the key is having written statements along the way that everyone can live and breathe and know that in the event, okay, we've got to pull the red light, this is what's going to take place and this is the communication that we will deploy.
love that. Love that,
Uh,
Lori.
yeah, it's important. So then what we do, and in this situation, we did a lot of training and simulation. So it's all about the what ifs and defining all that as we've talked about, but training and simulation, and even it's almost like media training at this stage. If this happens, we're going to respond to this way. Here are potential questions and rehearsing them.
Hmm. Yeah, and snippets, right? What do those look like? How will it look like when we talk in social?
Yep.
What would be the talk track for a CEO versus the rest of the leadership team, right? What about our friendlies, our customers? Because they could also be part of this, right? They could actually be advocating for whatever, the mitigation part of it. I, I am such a proponent of planning,
Yeah.
right? Especially in this world where there are so many unknowns. It's kind of like not having insurance and knowing that things will happen.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy that it hasn't been prioritized. But I think this also comes from, you know, people don't quite understand the risks,